The title of this lecture is Rewriting Traditions. Essentially, is an attempt to understand how scholars have attempted to relate the early Christian Gospels to one another, specifically those Gospels found in the New Testament. Let's begin with a brief review. Remember that in an earlier lecture, we discussed the ways in which the Gospels resemble ancient biography. This led us to certain conclusions about the nature of the New Testament Gospels. First of all, we want to see the Gospel writers as authors. They're not just editors, they're not just compilers, but they are authors who have an intentional message to convey, and they reshape the story of Jesus in particular ways. Okay, let's consider the major considerations that must be taken into account when you're trying to relate the Gospels to one another. First, we'd like to consider areas of overlap. These can be as large as the overall ordering of events, from a beginning, middle to the end, or even to different sections of the Gospels that demonstrate significant overlap. It can be seen in similar stories that are perhaps only slightly different, or maybe a name is changed, or maybe it occurs at a different point in one Gospel than it does in another. And then, of course, there are instances of word agreement, so that if you were to compare the Greek text of one Gospel with the Greek text of another Gospel, you would see some pretty significant overlap. In addition to considering areas of overlap, however, you must also consider the distinctive elements in each. Again, this can be anything including the content, what's included, what's not included, the arrangement of that content, where does a story occur in Mark's Gospel as opposed to where it occurs in Matthew's Gospel, and specific emphases that occur throughout the Gospels. And then finally, another major consideration is, what about John? One of the things that this lecture will focus on is the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are known as the Synoptic Gospels. When you begin to consider John, or even other non-canonical Gospels, the question of relating the Gospels becomes even a little more complex. So for this lecture, we're going to concentrate on the synoptic problem. Okay, what is the synoptic problem? Well, let's break it down. First, synoptic means seen together as a whole. This simply means that Matthew, Mark, and Luke see the story of Jesus alike. Therefore, they're called the Synoptic Gospels. You can line up the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke in columns, and you can compare both the overall structure of the Gospels as well as the specific stories found within. Problem. Why is this a problem? Well, essentially, the problem is trying to account for the broad and minor similarities and differences. Any, quote, solution to the problem needs to account for both the similarities and the difference among the Synoptic Gospels. Now, first of all, it's important to point out that this is not a new problem. This is not a problem of modern scholarship. This was not introduced by secular scholarship on the Gospels. Rather, it's a problem that was noticed early in the reception of the Gospels, both by insiders and by outsiders. So let's discuss some of the similarities among the Synoptic Gospels. First, the first three Gospels share a fairly standard common core. There is a period of Jesus' Galilean ministry. Also, there is overlap in the story from Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi. And then, of course, there's a great amount of similarity in the final week of Jesus' life. So those three parts are what we might refer to as a common core of the Synoptic Gospels. But there are also some synoptic differences. So we have really important additions to that common core. We have beginnings and endings in Matthew and Luke. Remember, Mark's Gospel doesn't have a birth narrative, nor does it have a developed resurrection account. But in Matthew and Luke, both of these things have been added. In Luke's Gospel, we have what amounts to almost a third of the entire Gospel devoted to the travel narrative, from when Jesus sets his face to Jerusalem in 951 until he arrives in 1927. And this consists of a number of teachings and miracle stories of Jesus. And this has been added to that common core. Similarly, the Gospel of Matthew includes 5 discourses that are not found in the Gospel of Mark, or at least they're not found in the same sort of concentration that they are found in the Gospel of Mark. Of course, there's the famous Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7. So each of these are an example of an addition to the common core. So how have scholars gone about solving the problem? Well, scholars have offered a number of different ways to relate Matthew, Mark, and Luke. To begin with, there is what is known as harmonization. And this isn't just scholars who have attempted this way. In fact, this is one of the earliest ways to deal with the differences in the Synoptic Gospels. So what is this? It's fitting the four Gospels into one single story. So a harmonization might start not with the birth narrative, but actually with the prologue of John's Gospel that talks about Jesus' existence before creation and role in creation, and go all the way through the resurrection account. So how do you do this? Essentially, you try to eliminate differences, especially as they relate to chronology. Now, just a couple of examples of the sort of difficulties of doing so. When we read the Synoptic Gospels, it seems as though Jesus had a one-year ministry, a one-year public ministry. And that's based on the festivals that he attends and so on and so forth. But in the Gospel of John, it appears to be at least a 3-year ministry, as 3 different Passover celebrations are mentioned, and these only occur once a year. So the person who wants to harmonize the Gospels must ask him or herself, how do you account for those chronological differences? Likewise, we must ask the question whether the cleansing of the temple happens at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, as it does in John's Gospel, or at the end in the Synoptics, or if both occur. So you might have a cleansing at the beginning and the end. Of course, these are just 2 examples of the sorts of things that need to be worked out through harmonization. There are many examples of both scholars and significant figures in church history who took this approach, including Tatian, Augustine, and Calvin. The second option is reinterpretation. So what is this? It's an allegorical or a spiritual approach to the Gospels. Essentially, the way in which you reinterpret the differences is to propose a spiritual meaning versus a material meaning or a physical meaning. So where there are differences, those differences may reflect that on the one hand, there's a story that is the physical. It's telling the story, the historical story, and that another story perhaps that is in contrast to that story is the spiritual meaning. An example of this approach is the very famous exegete Origen, who read the Gospels sort of with this attention to the spiritual versus the material. The third are what are known as source theories. What are these? These are essentially theories that solve the relationship between the Gospels by suggesting that the differences are due to different oral or written sources. So how does one go about sort of harmonizing or working out the differences between the Gospels? Well, you identify and isolate distinct sources in the Gospels, and you look for the earliest source text. But then you're faced with other questions like, is it a single source? Are there multiple sources? What sort of questions does this suggest for our view of the authors of the Gospels? Are they editors? Are they simply compilers of sources? Or are they sort of authors in their own right? Examples of this approach is generally 18th and 19th century New Testament scholarship. This was a very popular way of doing scholarship. Scholars thought that they could see seams within the Gospels and sort of locate and isolate different sources. Finally, there is the suggestion of literary dependence. And this is similar to source theory, but it's looking at the sources as more complete Gospels. So this suggests that later Gospels know of and use earlier written Gospels. So it's not just oral tradition, it's not disparate units of tradition, written or oral, but it's a more developed Gospel tradition. So the earliest view was that the chronological order reflected the canonical order, which is to say that Matthew was written first, then Mark, then Luke, and finally John. And so in this view, Mark actually epitomizes or shortens Matthew's gospel. So early examples of this include Clement of Alexandria and Augustine. And some form of literary dependence is what is advocated by most modern scholars. This is the way that they tend to relate the Gospels to one another. And so let's spend some time thinking about this a little bit. There are a number of ways to talk about this literary dependence. So some basic explanations. The first is what is known as the two gospel hypothesis and is associated with the scholar Griesbach. And essentially this proposes that Matthew was written first and that then Luke uses Matthew, and finally Mark uses both Matthew and Luke to form an epitome or a shortened version. So very similar to that earliest view of Matthew's priority. And so again, in this view, the two gospel hypothesis, Matthew's written first, then Luke, and then Mark uses both Matthew and Luke to shorten his own form. Another example is what is known as the two-source hypothesis, and this is associated with the scholars Weiss and Holtzmann. Essentially, this thinks that Mark was written first. There is Mark in priority. And then Matthew is the result of Mark and a second source, known as Q. And Luke is basically Mark and that second source, Q. And so Q is simply a shorthand reference for second source. And so let's talk just briefly about Q. This essentially is a shorthand reference to material shared by Matthew and Luke that is not present in Mark's gospel. It is a matter of scholarly speculation. It's approximately 230 verses of mostly teaching. A third example is sort of a modification of the two-source hypothesis, which we just discussed, which is, again, it's called the four-source hypothesis. It suggests that Mark was written first, and that then there is actually unique source material in Matthew and Luke, known as M and L. So this results in the view that there are four sources: Mark, Q, M, and L, and that these sources have been sort of combined in different iterations in what we now know as the New Testament Gospels. A final theory, and probably the one that I'm closest to, is associated with the scholar Ferrer, and it's called the Ferrer theory. And it proposes that Mark was written first, and that Matthew then wrote using Mark's Gospel, and that Luke then used both Matthew and Mark to compose his own Gospel. And among other things that support this view is the opening of Luke's Gospel, which simply states that there were other orderly accounts of Jesus' life and ministry that Luke consulted before composing his own. So with this in mind, I'd like for you to take a time to do a short writing reflection. So Luke's Gospel begins with these words: "Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word." In a reflection designed for an adult education class, use this opening to explain the relationship between Luke and other, quote, orderly accounts of Jesus' life found in the New Testament. All right, so in conclusion, I want to return briefly to this question of the synoptic problem. I want to ask if it's better to think of it as a problem to be solved or a mystery to be pondered. Now, what do I mean by this, pondering versus solving? Well, problems are solved. They're figured out. But mysteries are pondered. And when it comes to the mystery of Christ, we think about this question: is one gospel sufficient? Is it possible to tell the whole life of Jesus in one gospel? And of course, from a Christian theological perspective, we would say no. That the person of Christ is somehow inexpressible. And so the Gospels are necessary, but they are not sufficient for expressing this mystery of Christ. And we see examples of this even in the Gospel of Luke, where it's hard to recognize Jesus in his resurrected glory in Luke 24. The disciples don't get him. And so there is a mystery about Jesus' person, even in the Gospels that tell the story of who Jesus is. And finally, it underscores this need to retell and reinterpret, to make Jesus real today, both in the ancient context when the Gospels were being written, but also in our modern context, that part of what we're doing in our preaching and in our teaching and our reflecting on who Jesus is and presented in the Gospels is this desire to retell and reinterpret that story for our hearers today, for our congregations today. And so rather than trying to solve this relationship between these Gospels, I invite you to think about them as opportunities to ponder and to reflect and to wonder at the mystery of who Christ is and how that mystery might inform your preaching and inform your teaching. Thank you for your time.